Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Best Practices for Managing Your Facility in Times of Crisis. What should we expect for the future? My name is Indira Farah from the ARC Facilities Marketing Department. And before we get to the panelists today, I want to let you know that you can go ahead and type your questions throughout the presentation in that right-hand panel on your screen. And we'll get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll make sure to reach out individually. So on the agenda today, I'll be introducing the speakers, and then we will get into a panel discussion. We'll have some poll questions along the way, and then we will have some time for questions at the end, and then we'll wrap up. So why don't I go ahead and introduce today's speakers. Our moderator today is Steve Mott. Steve is the Director of Channels and Business Development here at ARC Facilities, and has over 18 years of experience as a facilities management professional. In his previous position at Williams-Sonoma as a facility manager, Steve oversaw staff maintenance and repairs at a campus of 10 buildings, including office, warehouse, and data center space in San Francisco, California, while heading up the emergency preparedness team. And our guest speaker today is Art Kirkland. Art currently serves as the Director of Emergency Services for NBC Universal in Universal City, California. In this capacity, he oversees emergency preparedness, response, and recovery for the Universal Studios lot and their operations. Previously, Art served as the Director of Emergency Management at Tulane University and at UCLA. During his tenure, he served as Incident Commander for Hurricanes Katrina, Gustav, Ike, and Isaac, as well as active shooter incidents and Southern California fires. He's designed emergency management programs from the ground up, as well as evaluated programs at all levels. So looking forward to speaking with Art today. And Suri Suryakumar is the CEO of ARC Document Solutions and the founder of ARC Facilities. In the last 10 years, Suri has led ARC to invest in technology to become a leader in access to information and facilities for the built space. Under his leadership, ARC has developed advanced search, optical character recognition, and auto hyperlinking tools for large and small format documents in the facilities space. And Todd Moore is a Senior Manager of Customer Success here. And prior to that, he was a National Director of Facility Solutions. Todd consults and advises facility professionals across education, healthcare, manufacturing, and government sectors on how technology can transform their operations. And Todd's been here at ARC for 16 years with a total of 25 years of experience in the industry. And then we have Brian Minch, who is a Senior Director at ARC Facilities and focuses on building critical customer relationships across the U.S. in healthcare, real estate, manufacturing, government, and education sectors on how digital transformation is changing the way facilities operate. So we are going to start the presentation with a poll question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Steve, our moderator. So our first question, how prepared is your team to deal with a major crisis? Fully prepared, mostly prepared, somewhat prepared, struggling to recover, completely caught off guard. Steve, we'll wait for a few seconds here, and I'll pass it over to you to get things started.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Indira. And thank you, everybody, for participating and making your selections here. We'll look for the responses. They should come up momentarily and then move into our discussion. Okay, well, there we have the responses to the first quick poll. And it looks like a few of the participants feel that they're fully prepared for a major crisis and how to deal with it. The majority might fall right in the middle between the mostly prepared and somewhat prepared. And then there's certainly some that are still thinking that maybe their preparedness wasn't up to snuff and they're struggling to recover at this time. So that's very good information. And it does lead us into our first part of this discussion today with Art from NBC Universal. And Art, I'd just like to touch on a few of your experiences firsthand and how to prepare for emergency situations when maybe the access isn't fully available to buildings, or even if some of your information is not available. So can you tell us, Art, a little bit about how your experience primarily at Tulane when Hurricane Katrina hit, and how that has sort of informed your process of preparing for certain emergency situations?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Couple things. One, before I even do that, I'm real interested in the poll question response that 80% of folks felt they were either somewhat or mostly prepared. At Tulane in New Orleans, we have a hurricane every other year. We brief the parents, we brief the students coming in and say, every other year you're going to have a hurricane. The students get really upset if they don't get their semi-annual 3-day hurricane. We had a well-oiled, well-exercised, and frequently executed plan for what to do for hurricanes. So we would have, if you'd asked me that question in 2005, I would have told you we were fully prepared. We weren't. We found out that there's disasters and there's catastrophes, and that kind of has focused my thinking about emergency preparedness ever since. I see everything through the lens of our Katrina experience. And by that, I mean, it's not enough to look at what's the most likely thing to happen. You have to kind of look at what's the worst thing that could happen. And if you're prepared for that, then you can handle the most likely case. Tulane, for those of you who don't know, is right on the Mississippi River. We flooded about half our campus, the newer portion of our campus, but we lost all of our utilities. We lost gas, water, electric, everything for a period of about 117 days. We had backed up our critical files, but all of our servers were down. So for 3 days, we were absolutely dark. We had very little idea of what was going on the campus, in spite of the fact that a large contingent of us had been there when the storm struck. We all evacuated. And for several weeks, really, we had no idea what was going on our campus. We found out as a result of that it's really important to have at least some method of remotely monitoring what's going on in your buildings and your facilities when those things happen.
Thank you, Art. That's fascinating. And I can imagine being there when something like that happens, and it's a big event. It was certainly newsworthy, and everybody was following the progress. So great to hear how you handled it at the time. Todd, I'd like to ask you, in your experience, how do some of your customers deal with preparing for an emergency or putting their plans in place? And do you feel like they've done a good job in terms of being prepared?
Sure, Steve. Thank you. I think really what it comes down to is access to information. So, we're still seeing a lot of our customers in paper content. They still have their trusty old 3-ring binders that are back in the office, and only a limited number of people have access to that information, which is a real problem considering, in Art's case, they weren't able to get back into the buildings, or in the crisis that we've got today. People are not allowed in the offices to access that information. The other side of that is digital content. And again, many of our customers are moving into digital content, which is a wonderful, smart move to do, but where is that content being stored? If that content is being stored on servers and whatnot, in the actual building or the facility, and the electricity goes out, like Art said, we're going to have issues with that. So again, looking at a cloud solution, or at least the ability to access that digital information when servers are down is really key.
Right. Very good. Thank you for that insight. I think that does take us right up to our next poll question. And if we can take a look at that and get the responses from the participants, that'd be great.
Yep, let's take a look at this question here. What has been the biggest challenge for your team during this crisis? Preventative maintenance, access to information, building security, providing a safe working environment, or managing the unknown?
Right. I can certainly see that whole range of the whole gamut of responses coming in here, just because this current crisis is outside anybody's standard operating procedure. But let's take a look and see how the responses come back to this quick poll, and then we'll move into a discussion. And there we go. Again, sort of a wide range of responses. If you start at the bottom, some of the biggest challenges certainly are managing the unknown. And I can imagine that in this situation being as widespread as it is, it's hard to prepare for something that's a national or global incident. So that's good. And right next to that, providing the safe work environment. I think priorities mostly are with tenants, our occupants, our users, and even the general public if we have a space that's open to the public. Certainly that's the case with Art at NBC Universal. And Art, maybe you can tell me how you prioritize critical versus non-critical building operations during a time like this, as well as maintenance. Ongoing maintenance is certainly an issue. How do you keep focused on the critical path? That'd be interesting information.
I like the last question. I'll get to it at the end. But the funny thing about critical buildings or critical even functions is they vary by what the emergency is and what's going on. So at Tulane, as an example, hurricanes rolled around. One of our critical functions was we had labs with live animals. And so keeping the animals alive and fed and watered and whatnot becomes a critical operation that you don't even think twice about, at least at my level, during the day-to-day operation of the facility, but it becomes a critical and hard to manage function when things go wrong. Right now, during the current crisis at NBC Universal, our primary continuing operation is obviously the news. What do you need to support that? And what we found was that ends up being a big spiral. So you have what the critical central function is, but then you have to go out a level and say what other functions are necessary to support that function, and then what functions are necessary to support those functions. Those become very difficult, and they tend to grow your staff. So that's not as problematic in a thing like today, when if I need somebody else on the lot, I can say, okay, I need to go to the lot, or I need another firefighter on the lot, or I need EHS personnel on the lot. Not necessarily true in other kinds of disasters, when people's ability to get physically to a building can be difficult. As an example, we had an active shooter incident at UCLA back in 2016, and basically you could get no information. You could go to no building out of 170 some odd buildings we had on the campus. You were in the building you were in, and that's the only place you get information. So having some sort of a remote access to building information becomes critical for a lot of reasons. To me, there's two parts to that. One is that you have to have that established. You have to have some kind of established function of being able to check on what the systems are going on in a building or in a situation on a regular basis, or else you won't know how to do it in an emergency. I think we lose 25 or 30 IQ points whenever there's an emergency, and we become lots less functional than we were otherwise. But what I find is we build those systems. We have a great building information system at work, but it's in a particular building. So a couple of things is, one, when we don't have access to the lot, we have very limited access to that, and we're restricted to basically making a phone call and asking somebody to look at a screen for us. And two, if we lose that building, you got no access to it. I don't have a backup access. It goes to a point that was made just a few minutes ago about being able to look at things in the cloud, and being able, and not having every emergency manager in the world has an emergency plan somewhere on a shelf that hasn't been updated in the last 10 years. Paper is good because you can take paper with you. The cloud is good because the cloud goes everywhere, but neither one of them is a cure-all. I had a friend once upon a time who ran his emergency operations center off of Google Chromebooks, which is great until you lose internet, and then your entire IT system goes down. So redundancy and having information available in multiple formats is a key part to how we manage building information. But even then, we find that things we didn't know we needed to look for cause problems. You asked about maintenance. We have cut back on periodic maintenance of things that we don't think are going to break because we're not using them. We've cut back. We have a lot of buildings on the lot right now that are not being occupied at all. But we find we still have to look at the maintenance of systems even in those situations. We had a situation a week or so ago where a pinhole leak developed in a water line in a building that's unoccupied, and it leaked for a good long while because there was no automated system to tell us, hey, you've got water on the floor. And so we had a lot more damage than we would have had we had something in place to monitor the health of that particular system in a building. So I guess that to wrap it all up in one neat little bundle is critical functions are not static. Critical functions change from emergency to emergency, and from task to task to task. So you have to be aware of what actually is critical and how you're determining that. And then monitoring those critical functions and communicating those, you've got to have multiple methods of doing it. There have to be redundancy. They can't be interlinked so that if one fails, they all fail. And you've got to avoid that single point of failure for any of those systems.
Right. That's great. Thank you. And certainly being an essential business right now, as the news is, you're right on the front line of it, and you have to be there. You have to be up and running to keep people informed. And a key source of information right now is the network news. And again, you're right in the middle of that. So thank you. And I'd like to ask Brian from Art, what type of information you might have from some of your customers on their best practices, and how do they effectively communicate and share info about building operations during a time like this?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I think Art said it amazingly eloquently, and that's what I'm finding a lot of in my daily conversations with our customers, checking in with them and seeing how they're doing. The situation is so fluid with what they're dealing with right now. The conversations are really centering not so much around best practices that have now proven to be not enough, but really more around the ability to immediately update information instantly and be in constant communication with their team using a variety of methods. And when I say their team, it's not just their team, the facilities team who are really leading the charge and responding to all of this. It's the C-level stakeholders and the primary user base of the facility itself. So it's critical that they are communicated to constantly because of how quickly things are changing and needs are progressing. This can go anything from electronic or digital means of communication through the old paper binders, which never were updated, but in some cases are being reprinted on a daily basis, sometimes twice a day with different changes, and also even signage. So they're finding they're having to employ a variety of methods as long as they're able to communicate as quickly as possible to everybody so there's no confusion.
Well, great. Thank you. That's great information right from the users. And I'd like to ask Suri, as a key corporate stakeholder in an event like this, well, all the time, and then certainly now during a COVID-19 pandemic, how do you handle business interruption during a significant event like this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Steve. Just listening to both Art and Brian, I mean, no two crises come in the same shape or form. And how do you then manage your critical functions during this period, and how do you prepare for that? COVID, especially, is an extraordinary crisis, unlike any other. The entire country being shut down for a pandemic is something that I've never experienced in my life. But the key is from a management perspective, for us to be quick and nimble and collaborate with the critical team members to identify the critical functions in order to make sure that we are maintaining business continuity in those areas where we need them. So the whole idea here is, because if you're local in one building, it's one thing, but if you have a campus, or if you're spread across the nation like we have almost 180 locations. And situations vary from California to Colorado to Arizona to New York to New Jersey. So the whole idea is to get the key people together and quickly collaborate with them, and then, have access to information. That's critical. I think, Art said it very clearly. If you don't have information, you're dead in situations like this. But if you have information, the key is to have the information and, a lot of redundancies in order to make sure that you always have information, and then quickly collaborate with the team, identify the critical issues for maintaining business continuity. That's what I would add.
Right. Interesting and great comments. I like when you said you need to be nimble, and that's certainly true with virtually every business now that's being affected. And certainly when you talk about continuity and trying to figure what your best practices might be during a time like this, it's almost like you have to perform triage. I was thinking along the lines of the healthcare industry or in a natural disaster, you have to look at your equipment, your regular maintenance, and figure out what is most important, and then move on with those high level priorities. And so that's really good information. Part of what comes with this whole discussion is being prepared in advance and having a good emergency communication plan. And that's our next poll question.
Yes, so the next poll question is, how confident are you with your emergency communications planning and systems? Is it 100% reliable, mostly reliable, needs work, problematic, or unknown?
Great, good. Thank you, Indira. And certainly the bit about being confident, that's an individual's way of handling with the situation. And if you have a plan that's been well developed and massaged over time and has been updated, it has all the bits and pieces you need in it, then you probably do have a pretty good confidence level. Let's see how the respondents are great. Well, more than half are either 100% reliable, confident about the reliability of their plan, or mostly reliable. So that's excellent. That's a great answer, because that means that when something happens, even if it's an unknown or entirely new situation, we feel good about our planning. So great, and that'll take us right into our next discussion. And I'll ask Art, when it comes down to this type of emergency situation, again, in your experience, and you've had some great experience in these type of situations, but a catastrophe, how have you managed communications, and really how prepared are you to keep in touch with staff and occupants and major stakeholders?
It's funny, I've kind of grown up with the emergency communication industry. When Katrina hit in 2005, I don't know how many folks had some kind of emergency communication system in place. We certainly didn't. One of the first things we ran into was just the difficulty in communicating with all of our stakeholders. We had physical addresses for people in most cases. We had, I want to say 20 some odd % of our staff didn't have an email address. We didn't have phone numbers for most folks. And even had we had them, the physical addresses and the phone numbers weren't there anymore. So I went from that, and we found during Katrina, and this is part of my Katrina lens, communication with your staff and stakeholders is the most important thing that happens in the managing of an emergency in the long term. The preservation of life and safety at the beginning is obviously the most important thing, but as an emergency goes on, communication is the most important thing you do. Some things I have seen that I think are critically important over the years of the development of this is, number one, you've got to pre-script your communications for emergencies. I said earlier, you lose 20 or 25 IQ points when an emergency hits. You will write things that look totally reasonable to you and find out they're totally misunderstood by your recipients if you try to do it during an emergency. During the shooting I referenced earlier, we found that Murphy, everybody knows Murphy, and Murphy's in charge of every emergency. Murphy was there that day, and my person who was responsible for emergency communications was home sick in Ventura County when that happened. And so I'm trying to manage the emergency as the incident commander and send out emergency communications. We did a great job with getting early communications because we had pre-scripted, pre-canned communications and a great system for getting them out. So we managed to notify our entire facility within about 3 minutes of the first shot being fired that they needed to shelter or to lock down. What I did a lousy job of is I didn't get a second communication out saying what was going on for an hour and 45 minutes, which was about an hour and 43 minutes too long. So frequent communication, even if it's just to say nothing's changed, is a big, big deal. And it's real easy to overlook that in a long-term or a longer-lasting emergency such as what we have now. I don't know about most places, but we're running at a minuscule amount of our staff is actually on the lot. The folks who are working from home or the folks who are at home and not working really want to know what's going on, and you cannot over-communicate. So you have to have a system for doing that. And I'll go back to what I said about the building system. It's got to be reliable. The 40% of folks that say your system needs work, that scares me. I'm a terrible customer for these kind of things because my standard is when I push the button, it has to work every time, every single time, no questions asked. If there's a problem, you will hear from me. It will be loud. It will be immediate. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be redundant, and it's got to be something that you can manage simply without having to put a whole lot of thought into it.
Right. Exactly. Good. So I like your input about having pre-planned, pre-programmed responses and just pushing those out. That certainly is, think about the people out there that may not have eyes on a situation, or they certainly have people who are being affected. They want to know. They want to have an update. So that's great. And Art, in a conversation we had earlier, you mentioned an interesting phrase that I like, unconscious incompetence, and how that fits in with your situation.
Yeah, I pull that phrase up from a past life. But the idea is you don't know what you don't know. You're unconsciously incompetent. It's not that you're stupid or that you're mismanaging information. It's you don't know what you don't know. And during an emergency, that is a frequent problem, not only from up to down, but when you have first responders show up on a scene. I've been fairly fortunate in my last 3 jobs, actually, to have emergency responders that I work with every day. And so they know me, they know my facility, they know the ins and outs and little tricky places. But it can be interesting for when first responders show up at a building. The last 3 places I worked, NBC, Tulane, and UCLA, were all places where we have buildings with names, and we have our own internal network of streets, but nobody has a street address. And so trying to describe to a firefighter how to get to Murphy Hall at the UCLA campus is not the easiest thing on the face of the planet. And then once he gets there, knowing what the hazards are and communicating those to him are critical and very difficult. We had, again, at UCLA, we had 3,000 odd labs. Every lab has its own unique set of hazards. The official way of doing business is there's a book in the fire control room that lists all the hazards. A, you got to get to the fire control room to get it. B, nobody knows when the last time it was updated. And the one thing I can tell you for sure is it's not accurate. And so firefighters are loath to go into rooms that are marked as hazardous because they don't know what the hazard is. The holy grail of communication to first responders during emergency right now is something that in real time could tell them these are the hazards. And not only the hazard, but these are the hazards. These are the mechanical systems that are associated with dealing with the hazards. This is where the hazards are stored in particular rooms. That's information that's critical and right now really, really difficult to get to a first responder when they show up. So they walk into a situation unconsciously incompetent. They don't know what they don't know.
Right. Very good. Interesting. And we can probably talk about that for a long time. But anyway, I do want to go to Todd briefly and ask, per your customer base, what are some of the best practices that they may use in order to contact key personnel and vendors and stakeholders and again, the general public in an event that may require emergency response?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So, so what we see here is, or what I've seen is a couple of things. Customers are telling me a couple of things is, let's face it, with our smartphones, which is an appliance we all have with us, seems like nonstop. Phone numbers and emails are usually close at hand and very easily accessible. But now it's the information that we need to send to them, that we need to share with them. First of all, going back to what I said earlier, where is it and what form is it in? Is it in a book? It is in paper? Is it on a server? Is it in the cloud? Who has access to it? So, all of those things, bears really looking at. I think Art touched on something fairly important, and that's the whole aspect of how to share it, especially with emergency responders coming on site. If there's one building and it's a 1-floor building, that one's fairly easy, but pull up to a corporate park, pull up to a corporate campus or a lot like Art works in. I mean, there's buildings that aren't marked, there's streets that aren't marked, and being able to navigate somebody through that, is going to be really, really tough to do without some kind of backbone in place. And then, something that's I think more relatable to what we're going through now is the situation is very fluid. We're getting guidance from different agencies all the time, and it's really being able to change our plans, to modify those plans, and then reshare that information for those who need to access to be able to access. Right, definitely, and I'm sure all our listeners are experiencing the same type of situations. One particular instance I'd like to ask Suri about is if your contact list or your distribution list is digital, how do you take advantage of maybe an alternative source of information when cell service or internet connections might be down, and really, the best practice around that?
I mean, that, obviously both internet and cell service being down at the same time, I hope it's rare, but certainly can happen. Both of these aspects are being improved as we speak, since our entire life revolves around internet and cell connection these days, especially these days. I think the key, in some of the, again, Art touched on it and, Todd touched on it. The important thing is to have access to information, and then how do you share that information? So obviously, previously it would be a call or sending an email. Today, you can share it, you can text it, you can share a video, you can be in one part of the campus and quickly share a video with somebody else, or, share a plan or a sketch with somebody else. And those features are available. A lot of people do real time, using variety of tools you have, which is commonly seen mostly in the social networks. But I think the key is, if both self-service and internet are down, then it's going to be a bit of a challenge. But some of the latest devices do have the ability to store some of the important data synced. In other words, if you have the information on the cloud, some critical information is synced on your iPad or on your mobile device, so that even if the services are down, you can get access to it. So I think that would be the only option, additional, precaution you can take. But one of the other things I find with mostly in the facilities are, they do have self-service, they do have internet access, but they will end up saying, but we don't have very good access in all the campuses. We only have access in certain parts. I think that's something that we can overcome to prepare. I think every facility manager should make sure that in all corners of the building, they should have internet access. It's cheap, really, to make sure once you have the main internet coming into your property, then making sure that's available in every corner of the building. I think it's critical. It's becoming increasingly critical, because both phone lines and internet are interchangeable these days. Data can be shared through any one of these. So I think that's important, Steve.
Right, it is definitely, and you think about certain catastrophic events where something may happen in a split notice, and that could be either a tornado or earthquake, or some type of levee break or dam breaking and the flooding. And absolutely, if all of a sudden the communication systems are overloaded with users making calls or sending texts or whatever, and if the service might be up but bogged down, then you run into another problem, and that's just the delay in making those communications. So that's good information, and I appreciate that, sir. Thank you. That will segue nicely into our next poll question.
Thank you, Steve. Let's pull that one up here. Looking ahead, how will emergency preparation and response change within your organization? Will it be an extreme priority, a higher priority, a slightly higher priority, no change, or unsure?
Okay, good. Thank you, Indira. And certainly, why everybody is considering their response to this question, I'd just like to say that mitigating risks and damage to your property is important during an emergency, but we also have to be prepared in advance for maybe a next event. So here's our results from that quick poll, and it looks like we have certainly an extreme priority and higher priority bent on this one. We're going to deal with what we've learned and how we've responded to this event, and be prepared again for the next one, and talk about how to best handle some of these instances, no matter what they are. There's a good chance that a pandemic like this could be more frequent going forward, and we want to be prepared. So I will ask Art at NBC Universal, how does your emergency preparedness plan remain vital and updated going forward? And do you think there are any changes that you anticipate making at this point, really, if any of them?
I think that we all tend to fight the last war. So I think that for a period of time, and we have short memories, so a period of time could be anywhere from a year to, if I'm lucky, 2, we will be very concerned about pandemics, and we will We'll probably exercise our pandemic plan again. We pulled out our pandemic plan at the beginning of this. Ours, like a lot of other folks, was based on an H1N1 scenario from 2008, and it didn't translate very well. One of the things I think every organization has to do, and it's fundamental in what I do for a living, is you have to do a thing called a hazard vulnerability analysis on a regular basis. You have to look at all the things that can possibly go wrong, that can affect your business. And then you have to look at those in terms of potential threats to your business. And there can be the obvious threats, the threat to life or physical harm to employees, tenants, visitors, guests, or the general public. But there's also the threats to damage or loss of use of your property, your buildings, those kind of things. But there's also the damage to your reputation or just your ability to do business in general. From a holistic standpoint, this current pandemic, really that last one, the ability to do business, has been the biggest effect. We've had relatively few folks personally affected by the disease itself. So we've had very little injury and no death, knock on wood, because of it. It hasn't damaged our facilities, other than the damage has happened because we're not in the facilities and not monitoring like we should. But it has definitely damaged our ability to do business and maybe to some extent our reputation. So I think what we have to do is look at those in terms of, look at all the hazards and then prioritize them and plan based on the priorities. But one of the problems in the emergency services, emergency management business is we have difficulty proving the return on investment for every dollar spent on emergency management. It's just difficult to do. An emergency communication system is expensive. And if everything works out the way we hope, the only time we use it is in exercises. So it's kind of hard after 5 or 6 years of nothing happening to justify spending $125,000 or $200,000 a year on an emergency communication system. To do that, we have to show what the potential loss is based on that, and then convince our folks in the C-suite that it's worth spending the money on these types of mitigation activities, where you can spend $100,000 today, but it can save you $5 to $10 million down the road. We go through this at NBC. We go through it on an annual basis. At UCLA, we went through it on an annual basis, and we were frequently surprised. You will find sometimes that the things that need to be mitigated are things that are boring and you don't want to think about. One of the highest cost losses at UCLA every year was cyber attacks. That actually costs us way more money than almost anything else, and we would not tend to think of it in terms of an emergency risk that needs to be mitigated. But if you look at those carefully every year, or as often as you can, then I think you find the things you need to mitigate against. And then things like this pop up and prove that you missed something you should have been looking at all along. Right.
Very good. I mean, certainly, again, I think everybody is experiencing these same type of situations, and you're right. It's taking ahead of an event. It's taking up the ladder the discussion about costs and the ROI, and certainly the risks of bad incident that could either take the company down or harm the PR value. So yeah, that's a whole nother discussion we could have about going to the C-suite with costs and the benefit analysis. So good. Thank you for that. I would like to ask Brian, just briefly, if you could comment on sort of the highest priority in ensuring the life safety for the actual users and occupants and the general public. You know, what does your clientele say about planning ahead in terms of that piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I think similar to what you and Art were just discussing, you know, they say that old adage about the best laid plans, right? And, you know, what happens when the situation is really at the forefront and you're going through it? So I think, you know, what I hear when I'm speaking with our customers and our prospects, what makes them the most nervous is the ability. The best way to be prepared is to ensure you have the ability to improvise and adapt on the fly, no matter what the situation you're faced with. And in order to do that, the fundamental of that ability is to have all of your building information in an up-to-date fashion, and at your fingertips, ensuring that it's shareable. So in whatever way that means, they must have that ability, that fundamental ability to improvise, adapt, and deal with whatever situation they have at hand. That's what they are going to the C-suite and talking about, especially as they, take a look at all of their emergency plans and what worked, what didn't work, what continues to do well, and what really was kind of a waste. But they're really focusing on that fundamental ability right now.
Yeah, good. Well, definitely. And, that's a perfect opportunity to go to our next poll question, because we do want to talk about what happens going forward and future planning. And Indira?
Yes, our next question is, how effective has technology been in placing your team manage a large-scale crisis or emergency? It's been excellent, moderately helpful, needs improvement, minimal help, or not helpful.
Right. Great. So thank you for that. And, technology is at the forefront of everybody's discussion right now. And we're wrapping up this presentation with talking about how we can make technology fit into our emergency response plans and really using it to the utmost and taking advantage of it, understanding the costs that are involved and making sure that there's a payoff. Excellent. The top answer is excellent. Technology has been a big help in managing these types of emergencies, or even moderately helpful. So there we go. There's over 80%, and a small slice that says they need to make improvements to it. And now, Art, let me ask you, if you're off premise and you need to access important information, how do you coordinate with your staff? And you did mention the first responders earlier. So is there an answer for that, technologically speaking?
Yes, and yes. I mean, there's an answer. As far as how we access information, again, I'm beating a dead horse, but I've got multiple levels of ways of doing the same thing. There's some hard copy information I keep with me all the time. There's some information, I think Suri made a comment, that I keep downloaded on my phone and my laptop that's with me all the time, even if I'm not connected to the web. And then we have repositories of information that are either in the cloud, combination in the cloud and on servers that I can get to as long as I have an internet connection. It creates some interesting problems. We have not decided at my current place or at NBC, at Tulane or UCLA, either for that matter, on a standard group communication technology for two-way communication. We have emergency messaging down pat, but when it comes down to we need to have a meeting to talk about how we're going to bring a production on the lot or how we're going to reopen buildings on the campus. Right now, I think we're using Jabber and Teams and Cisco Teams and probably a couple other methods across the organization to communicate. There's no standard. That creates interesting problems. The other thing with technology in our this plan is folks have to be familiar with its use. And so a lot of these, Teams is a good example. I've used it for years in different places. And so I'm really familiar with it, but I find members of my team are not. And so there's a training piece that I was not prepared to do as the emergency started going. If you want to try something really fun sometime, hand somebody a satellite phone that's never used it before and ask them to dial a number. It's second nature if you've done it, and if you haven't, it's absolutely impossible to comprehend. So technology will continue to play a piece, but I think the technology's got to be intuitive and it's got to be integrated in what we're doing day to day, because it's got to be a tool. It can't be a hindrance to what we're trying to do when we're responding. The same thing with we're talking about first responders. I would love to have something that I can sling information to a first responder, and it doesn't matter that I haven't ever seen this particular firefighter before. I can get the information to him quickly in a format he or she understands and can use, independent of platform. Does that make sense?
That does. That's great. Thank you. And again, that's right from the boots on the ground perspective. I would like to ask Suri if you'd share some of your thoughts on really preparing for building emergencies by integrating technology and how it can fit into the facilities management arena, especially the AI and machine learning aspects.
I think both AI and machine learning will play a huge role in the future of facilities management. Art clearly said, all of the key points he touched on. I'm just going to translate that to what would it look like. So, for example, what we experience in the facility space, my experience with all the existing customers, most of the existing customers are that, we have some information in paper, quite a few of them have gone digital, but we are still stuck with desktops and, legacy systems. We need to move away from those for the facility management and then get into these technologies today, which is number one, information should be available anytime from anywhere, which means it has to be mobile and cloud. And they have to be enabled by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, for example, I'm sure every one of the participants in the webinar would have heard the names. These names are very common now, like Alexa, Siri, or Hey Google. That's something we talk about all the time. Just imagine when you're in a hurry or when you have an emergency, that if you can just say, hey, Alexa, where is the shut-off valve? Or if you can just ask Siri, where is the gas shut-off valve? I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? Well, if you can actually tell Alexa, I want to order the next 2 cartons of beer for your game, which we can do today, right, on Amazon, then there is no reason we can't use the same technology in the facility space. You can certainly ask Siri to switch on your lights. You can ask Google to play music. You can ask Alexa to order food. We already have those. These are not new technologies. These are technologies we have. But what we need to do in the facility space is shift ourselves, move ourselves into these technologies. Then you can examine the scenario like Art said, how do I want to now share this information? How, what platform is this information available on? So I think what AI and machine learning does, it allows you to actually read building information or extract building information without human intervention. I think that's exactly what Art was saying, training people on software. Nobody trains me to use Google or, Uber, order Uber or go to Uber Eats or whatever that is. There is no training required because it's intuitive. That's exactly what Art said. So AI and machine learning can help us build intuitive technologies that we can actually talk to our devices or communicate with our devices in such a way that is extremely powerful. But that's a shift we need to make.
Great, sir. That's really fascinating topic, and again, we could spend a whole other session on that. So thank you. And really, the future is now, and it's coming even faster. So here we go, and that leads me into one final wrap-up poll question. And if Indira, you can take that.
Yeah, so we're going to ask again a question that we had asked in the beginning, if you could pull that question up. So after listening to the discussion today, how prepared is your team to deal with a major crisis? We're kind of just interested in seeing if there's been a change after hearing Art and the panel speak today. So Steve, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, regardless of how you answered earlier on the first poll question, go ahead and take your best shot at responding to this one. It's really just a good experiment to see how raising the topics, discussing the scenarios, getting insight from the people that are on the ground, and then understanding whether you have the same sense of preparedness or a different sense. So if everybody's making their selections, we can take a look at the answers, the responses, and then see where it fits in with that first question we had earlier. I would say that we are maybe a little better, actually quite a bit better. We're at 90%, 96% are feeling fully prepared, mostly prepared or somewhat prepared. So the answers have shifted up, and it's great that it's great that we get that kind of response based on the discussions we've had today. So thank you for that. And I will ask Indira to see if there are any questions from the field.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for some questions. I'm going to dive right in. That some of them come in. So the first one I have here is, what are some of your reopen strategies? Are there any that have worked in the past that you are able to use with this current pandemic?
Yeah, that's great. I think because of Art's experience in handling major catastrophes and then coming back out of them, I wonder if Art, you could handle that one.
Sure. The thing that I've done in the past, we did it for Katrina, we did it for another thing that we're doing, and we will do it for this, is you've got to have a strategy for reopening, and it has to involve throttling up. Frequently, we think we're going to throttle down, and these things that closing is suddenly. You've got to have a strategy that involves having people on the ground ready to receive people as they come in. So you can't just say, okay, May the 15th is here, the stay-at-home order is up, and we're all going back to work. You have to plan the return to operations with as much detail as you plan your emergency response to the emergency itself. And the other thing I'll add to that is that planning needs to start the day you leave. So you need the day you walk out or the day that you find you can't come to work because of an earthquake or a hurricane or some other act of God. You need to start planning for how you're going to come back to work. So the recovery planning starts the first day of the response.
Right. Good. And there's a lot of information out there now about how to prepare a building. Say you have a high rise and you need to be able to make adjustments for this social distancing. And yeah, if you're prepared and if you have the right tools in your work box, then great. You're a step ahead, and you probably will fly through it. But there are certainly still some unknowns when the country dives back into reoccupying buildings. We'll see what the real truth is. Suri, do you have a comment on maybe how we would repopulate some of our office and commercial buildings?
In this instance, Steve, it's very interesting because if you think about it, usually a facility manager would be largely thinking about, we're going to restart the building. We got to get all the, systems going. I want to make sure everything is working right, et cetera, et cetera. I think, though, this one's slightly different because the facility managers will be asked to actually think about people's behavior when they walk into the offices. What about the visual signage? Who actually comes to the entrances, and how do you get your deliveries? How do you organize it in such a way that you don't overcrowd conference rooms? I have this sense that most of that is going to actually rest on the shoulders of facilities managers to make sure that you mentioned social distancing is going to play a big role. I mean, it's going to, because people are scared, people are worried. Companies feel responsible for what's going on for the employees who are coming in here. So I think if you think about it, it has to do with people's behavior. For the first time, facilities managers may have to be concerned about how people are behaving in those facilities, right? And that simply means that organizing things in a way, this is the entrance, this is one way, everybody coming from this side and, go out from that, whatever that might be. It has to do with planning, exits, entrance, who congregates where, how they use the conference rooms, and all that has to be communicated on real time using visual signage. That's what I see happening going forward, at least in the instance of a very unique situation we have, which obviously is related to a pandemic.
Right. Again, great thought leadership there, because certainly that when you were talking, it made me think about, we probably need to take people's temperature as they enter a building or an airport. And we probably have to spend quite a bit more time talking about the vendors that come in and do the sanitation and the cleaning and how we're wiping everything down and making sure that there isn't a chance of transmission of any of the virus. So very good.
If you have any questions for us or any of the panelists, you can go ahead and send an email to solutions@arcfacilities.com, and we'll make sure that the right person gets your response. And our phone number is here, 855-500-0660. You can visit arcfacilities.com if you'd like to learn some information about our company. I do want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here today, and we hope to see you at another webinar. And please stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.